Story number 1.
The grocery store at the edge of town had been there for as long as anyone could remember. It was the kind of place that never closed, a convenience for night shift workers, insomniacs, and late-night snack seekers. Marissa worked the overnight shift. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. She didn't mind the quiet, though something about being alone in a nearly empty store unsettled her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sterile glow. The only sounds were the low murmur of the refrigerators and the occasional crackle of the ancient speaker system. Tonight was slower than usual. No customers in over an hour. Marissa was restocking shelves in aisle 3, lost in thought when she heard it. The distinct sound of a shopping cart moving. Her stomach tightened. She was sure she was alone. She poked her head around the aisle. The main walkway was empty, no carts in sight. Marissa shook her head. The store wasn't haunted, it was just her nerves. She went back to stacking boxes. Then she heard it again, a slow, deliberate squeak of cartwheels. Closer this time. She turned sharply. A single cart stood at the end of the aisle, empty. Marissa's pulse quickened. She was certain it hadn't been there before. She took a tentative step forward. The store was equipped with security cameras. Maybe she could check the footage. Then a sound. A soft rustling like footsteps on linoleum. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Nothing. Her heart pounded. This was ridiculous. Maybe she was just exhausted. She took out her phone and checked the time. 3:12 a.m. 2 more hours to go. She forced herself to keep working. Ignoring the creeping unease in her gut, she focused on her task. Then, the lights flickered. She froze. One of the bulbs overhead buzzed loudly, then burst with a pop, showering the floor with tiny glass shards. The store fell into an eerie half-darkness. Marissa exhaled sharply, trying to steady her nerves. She'd clean it up later. Then she saw something. At the far end of the aisle, just beyond the reach of the dim lighting, a shadow shifted. Her breath caught in her throat. Someone was there. She took a slow step backward. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. Her fingers tightened around the box in her hands, knuckles white. The shadow didn't move. She swallowed. "The store's closed. You're not supposed to be here." Still, no reply. Then the cart moved. Not a lot, just a few inches. But enough. Marissa's blood ran cold. She turned and ran. Her sneakers squeaked against the tile as she bolted toward the front of the store. Her only thought was to get to the security office, to check the cameras, to prove to herself that she wasn't imagining things. She reached the office and slammed the door shut behind her. With shaking hands, she pulled up the security feed. She rewound the footage, scanning the aisles. Nothing. No cart moving on its own. No shifting shadow. No one there at all. Marissa shook her head. She knew what she had seen. A loud bang echoed through the store. She jumped. It had come from the front entrance. Slowly, she turned her attention to the monitor displaying the store's entrance. A figure stood just outside the automatic doors. Tall, motionless. Its features were obscured by the poor quality of the camera feed, but she could make out one thing. It was staring directly into the store. Marissa's breath hitched. The doors were locked. She was sure of it. Then, the doors slid open. Her stomach twisted. The figure didn't move. For a long, tense moment, it simply stood there. Then, in an unnatural, jerking motion, it stepped inside. Marissa's hands trembled as she reached for the store's emergency phone. She dialed 911, pressing the receiver against her ear. The line was dead. The figure was still on the monitor, moving slowly through the aisles, its gait unnatural, its head tilting at odd angles. Marissa could barely breathe. Then, on the screen, it stopped. It turned, and it looked directly at the camera. At her. She gasped and staggered back. A deep, distorted voice crackled through the speakers. "You left the door open." The security monitor flickered, the lights in the store went out, and just outside the office door, a slow, deliberate knock. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The grocery store was nearly empty, just the way Daniel liked it. It was just past midnight, and the only sounds were the distant hum of refrigerators and the occasional crackle of static from the speakers overhead. Daniel worked the night shift alone, stocking shelves, cleaning up, and making sure everything was in order before the morning rush. He had been working at Parker's Grocery for 3 years, and nothing about it had ever scared him before. Tonight felt different. Maybe it was the flickering light in aisle 6, or the way the security mirrors seemed to distort reflections just a little too much. Or maybe it was just the silence, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the store itself was holding its breath. Daniel shook the feeling off and pushed his cart down the aisle, unloading cans of soup onto the shelves. Then he heard it. A soft scraping noise. At first, he thought it was the wheels of his cart sticking to the tile, but when he stopped moving, the sound continued. Scrape. Long and slow, like something being dragged. Daniel turned his head, expecting to see anything, but the aisle was empty. The store was still. His pulse quickened, but he told himself it was nothing. Maybe an old fridge kicking on, maybe something shifting in the stockroom. He went back to work. Scrape. This time it was closer. Daniel turned again, his heart thudding now. The store was still empty. The aisles stretched out, nothing but neatly lined shelves and artificial light. Hello? His voice echoed, swallowed by the stillness. No response. A chill crept up his spine. Trying to shake it off, he left his cart and walked toward the back of the store, toward the stockroom. If something was making that noise, it had to be from there. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing stacks of boxes and dim overhead lighting. Nothing unusual. Daniel stepped inside, scanning the room. Everything was where it should be. Then the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. Silence. He swallowed hard and reached for the door handle, but when he turned it, the door wouldn't budge. Locked. That wasn't possible. A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. He banged on the door. Hey, if anyone's out there, this isn't funny. Nothing. Then, just as he was about to reach for his phone, he heard something. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. Coming from the other side of the stockroom. Daniel's stomach clenched. He turned his head toward the far end of the room, toward the rows of shelves stacked with supplies. Someone was standing there, a figure. Tall, thin, its face obscured by the shadows. Daniel's breath caught. Who? The lights flickered. For a split second, the room went dark. When the light buzzed back on, the figure was gone. Daniel's chest tightened. His fingers dug into his phone as he fumbled to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dimness, illuminating nothing but shelves and boxes. No one was there. Then, a whisper. Right next to his ear. Daniel turned so fast he nearly tripped. The whisper had no words, just the sound of something dry and rasping, like wind through dead leaves. His entire body screamed at him to run, but the door was still locked. Then the lights flickered again. And in that brief moment of darkness, Daniel saw them. Not just one figure, but many. Standing between the shelves, watching. The lights buzzed back on. The stockroom was empty. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for the door handle again. This time it turned easily. The door swung open without resistance. The store was silent. Too silent. He stepped out slowly, his ears straining for any sound, any sign that he wasn't alone. But the aisles were just as empty as before, the store unchanged. Except for one thing. His cart. The cart he had left in aisle 6. It was gone. Daniel's breathing was uneven as he turned toward the front of the store. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe he was just exhausted. Then he saw it. The cart was there, but it wasn't where he had left it. It was at the far end of the frozen foods aisle, and it wasn't empty. Someone was standing behind it. Daniel's blood ran cold. The figure was tall, motionless, its head tilted slightly as if listening. Its hands rested on the cart's handle, but they were wrong. Long fingers, too pale, too thin. Daniel took a step back. His mouth was dry. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, it tilted its head further and smiled. The lights flickered. Daniel ran. He didn't stop until he was outside, the automatic doors sliding shut behind him. The parking lot was empty, the night air cold against his skin. He turned back toward the store. Through the glass doors, the aisles were still. But at the far end of the store, in the dim glow of the flickering lights, the figure stood, watching, still smiling. Daniel never went back. The next morning, the manager found the store unlocked, the night shift unfinished. Daniel's cart was still in the frozen foods aisle, exactly where he had last seen it. No security footage showed anything unusual. No one ever figured out what happened to him. The store remained open, but sometimes on the night shift, employees swear they hear it. A soft scraping, long and slow, like something being dragged, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The grocery store was nearly empty when Claire stepped inside. It was just past midnight and she had no real reason to be there, just a craving for something sweet and an excuse to escape the silence of her apartment. She had always found grocery stores unsettling at night, too quiet and too still, but she told herself it was nothing. Just another quick trip. The automatic doors whispered shut behind her. A lone cashier sat at the front flipping through a magazine. He barely glanced up as Claire grabbed a basket and wandered toward the candy aisle. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a pale artificial glow over the aisles. Something about the air felt heavier than usual. She shook off the feeling and walked toward the back of the store. As she passed by the produce section, she heard something. A soft shuffling. Claire slowed her steps. It was faint, almost too quiet to notice, but definitely there, like someone moving just out of sight. She glanced around. The aisles were empty. The cashier was still at the front, flipping pages. Claire exhaled, feeling silly. It was just her nerves, probably the refrigerators kicking on. She turned down the candy aisle, scanning the shelves for something that caught her eye. Then she heard it again. This time it was closer. A whisper of movement. She turned quickly, expecting to see another late-night shopper. Nothing. The store was too still. A chill crept up her spine. She grabbed a chocolate bar, tossed it into her basket, and started toward the front. Something wasn't right. She could feel it now, that strange awareness, like the store wasn't as empty as it seemed. As she neared the end of the aisle, her eyes flicked toward the security mirror overhead, and she froze. There, reflected in the curved glass, was a figure. A person. Standing motionless at the end of the frozen foods aisle. Claire's breath hitched. She turned her head. The aisle was empty. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She looked back at the mirror. The figure was still there, watching. Claire sucked in a sharp breath and forced herself to move. She walked quickly toward the front of the store, her hands tightening around the basket's handle. She didn't look at the mirrors again. The cashier was still at the counter, tapping at his phone. She dumped her items onto the conveyor belt. "Hey," she said, trying to sound casual. "Is there someone else in here?" The cashier glanced up, then looked around the store. "Nope, just you." Claire swallowed. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. She forced a tight smile. "Right, just me." The cashier scanned her chocolate bar. "You okay?" "Yeah," she lied. "Just tired." The register beeped. He bagged her items and handed them over. "Have a good night." She nodded, grabbed the bag and hurried toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open. The cold night air rushed against her skin. She stepped outside, and then she heard it, a soft, slow tap coming from behind her. Claire turned her head. Through the glass doors, the store was exactly as she had left it, almost. The cashier was still behind the counter. The aisles were still empty. But at the end of the frozen foods section, the figure stood, closer now, not moving, not breathing, just watching. Claire's hands tightened around her bag. She turned and walked to her car. She didn't look back. She never went to that store again. But sometimes when she passed by at night, she could still see it, standing just inside the glass doors, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The fluorescent lights flickered as Marissa pushed her shopping cart on the aisle of the grocery store, the faint hum of the coolers in the background. It was late, too late for most people, and the store felt unusually empty. The shelves were stocked with cans of vegetables and boxes of cereal, but there was something off about the quiet. The usual bustle of customers was absent, and it made the place feel more like a mausoleum than a store. She glanced at her watch, 11:43 p.m. She had stopped by after work to pick up a few things for the week. The store had always been quiet at night, but never like this. A chill ran through her as she pushed her cart further down the aisle. The air felt dense, almost suffocating. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. At the far end of the aisle, a figure stood. It was a man, or at least she thought it was. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadows, but she could see his thin frame outlined against the rows of canned goods. She couldn't place him. He wasn't wearing the usual store uniform, and there was something unsettling about the way he stood, motionless, staring at the shelves. Marissa hesitated. She wasn't the type to be intimidated easily, but this felt different. She shook her head and pushed the cart forward, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up her spine. The man didn't move. As she passed, she felt a brief flicker of his eyes on her, but when she looked, he was still staring at the shelves. She breathed a sigh of relief. Turning the corner, Marissa made her way toward the dairy section, hoping to get the milk and eggs and get out quickly. The store was eerily quiet. No music, no sounds of workers restocking, nothing but the dull buzz of the lights overhead. The flickering was getting worse. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and reached for the milk, but as she did, she heard it. A soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. It was distant, but it was there, unmistakable. Marissa froze, listening. The sound was faint, but it was coming closer. She turned toward the source, scanning the aisles. There at the end of the row, the man had moved. He was no longer in the same spot, but now he was standing just beyond the dairy aisle, his back turned to her. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel the weight of his presence. Her stomach tightened, and a wave of unease washed over her. Was he following her? Her breath quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She didn't want to appear paranoid, but something was definitely wrong. She grabbed her milk and eggs quickly, not taking her eyes off the man as she made her way toward the checkout. The store seemed to stretch on forever. A sense of claustrophobia began to seep in as she walked, the aisles narrowing with every step. The flickering of the lights became more erratic, casting strange shadows along the walls. She could still hear the dragging sound, closer now, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. When she reached the checkout, the man was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't disappear. Marissa rushed to unload her items onto the conveyor belt, her hands trembling. As she scanned the empty aisles, she saw something that made her freeze. In the reflection of the glass doors at the front of the store, there was no sign of the man, but there was someone else. A figure, tall and hunched, was standing in the shadows near the entrance. Marissa's heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its gaze on her, cold and unblinking. She tried to shake off the dread building inside her. Maybe it was just her imagination, running wild in the quiet of the store. But the more she looked, the more real it felt. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. Grabbing it quickly, she saw a text from her roommate. "Did you hear anything weird at the store?" Marissa's fingers froze on the screen. What did that mean? She quickly typed back, "What do you mean? What kind of weird?" Her phone buzzed again. "I don't know. I swear I heard something scraping, like something was moving. I thought maybe you were home already." Marissa's blood ran cold. The scraping sound. It was the same sound she'd been hearing. She glanced up again, but the figure by the door was gone. The store was completely silent, the only movement coming from the cashier as she scanned Marissa's items. But Marissa felt like she wasn't alone. She had to get out of there. "Do you need a bag?" the cashier asked, her voice flat and distant. Marissa didn't answer right away. Spat, she was too focused on the emptiness surrounding her. The scraping noise had stopped, but it still lingered in her mind. She grabbed the bag and turned toward the door, her breath coming faster now. As she approached the exit, she heard a loud thud. Something fell behind her, and she spun around to see nothing but the empty aisles stretching into the darkness. The doors slid open, and she quickly stepped out into the cool night air, feeling the weight of the store's oppressive silence lift. But as she walked to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She turned around once more, just as her hand brushed the door handle of her car. Standing at the entrance of the store was the man. His silhouette was barely visible, but she could see his eyes gleaming in the dim light. And then he smiled. It was a slow, creeping smile that seemed to stretch impossibly wide across his face. Marissa's stomach twisted. She didn't wait to see more. She yanked open the car door and slid inside, locking it quickly. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone, but the scraping sound was still there, just beyond the edge of her hearing. And it wasn't the last time she would hear it. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
The fluorescent lights in the grocery store buzzed faintly overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the aisles. The shelves were fully stocked, and the quiet hum of the refrigerated section mixed with the low murmur of a far-off freezer. It was late. Too late for most people, but Sarah wasn't in a hurry. She was used to coming here after work, a ritual she had followed for years. The store was usually nearly empty at this hour, and that was how she liked it. There was something soothing about the silence, the sense that the store was just hers for a little while. She pushed her cart past the rows of produce, absent-mindedly tossing in some apples, a bag of carrots, and a few onions. There was a calmness in the routine of it, something that helped her unwind after a long day. As she approached the dairy aisle, the soft squeak of her cart wheels was the only sound breaking the stillness. But then she heard something else. A faint scraping noise, almost like something dragging across the floor. She stopped, her hand hovering over the butter. She glanced down the aisle, her eyes scanning the shelves, but she saw no one. It was probably just a worker cleaning or restocking. She'd been coming here for years, and the place was always a bit off at night. The sounds of the store settling, the odd creaks and squeaks. Sarah shrugged it off and grabbed a carton of milk. But the scraping sound came again, closer this time. She froze, a chill creeping down her spine. "Hello?" she called out, trying to sound casual, but her voice trembled slightly. No answer. Just the quiet hum of the store. She let out a breath, trying to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe one of the workers had dropped something, maybe a cleaning cart was getting moved around, but the noise grew louder. It was unmistakable now, scraping, dragging, like something being dragged across the linoleum floor. The sound came from the far end of the aisle, near the freezer section. Sarah's eyes narrowed. There was no one there. "Hello?" She called again, louder this time, but her voice echoed in the emptiness. No one answered. The noise stopped suddenly. Dead silence. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She debated turning around and leaving, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She took a tentative step forward, her shoes clicking softly on the floor as she peered down the aisle. Her eyes flicked from the shelves to the dark spaces between them. That's when she saw it. At the end of the aisle, near the freezer, was a figure. It was standing still, just beyond the reach of the overhead lights, its face obscured by the darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It was just standing there, tall and unnaturally still. She couldn't make out any features, but she could feel its presence. It was like a cold weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating. She blinked and the figure was gone. Her heart skipped and she took a step back. "Okay, I'm just imagining things," she muttered to herself, clutching her cart a little tighter. She turned quickly, pushing her cart toward the front of the store, ready to grab her things and leave. But then she heard the scraping again, closer now. The sound was unmistakable, sharp and deliberate, like metal on tile. Sarah's eyes darted around, but the aisle was still empty. She started walking faster, her steps quickening, but the scraping followed her. Closer, closer until it was right behind her. She glanced over her shoulder, her pulse racing. Nothing. But the sound didn't stop. She spun around and without thinking sprinted toward the front of the store, her cart bumping and jerking as she rushed. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps. She could hear it now, unmistakably close, that scraping, that dragging noise, as though something was right behind her. "Excuse me. Is someone there?" she called, her voice breaking the silence. No answer, only the sound of her feet pounding against the tile and the eerie scrape that followed her. Sarah reached the front doors, her hands shaking as she pushed them open. She rushed outside into the cold night air, not caring if she looked ridiculous. She stopped for a moment to catch her breath, her chest heaving as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was she losing it? Had the stress of work been getting to her? She looked back at the store, the lights flickering behind her, casting a strange, uneven glow in the windows. It was quiet now, too quiet. No sounds of people inside, no distant hum of the freezers or the aisles. A figure moved across the window, its shadow flickering in the dim light. Sarah's stomach dropped. She wasn't imagining things. Someone or something was in there. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed her phone and dialed the number for the store. She could hear it ringing on the other end. She glanced back at the door, waiting, but there was no movement. "Thank you for calling," the automated voice finally answered. "Our hours of operation are 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. If you are calling outside of these hours, please leave a message." The line clicked off, and Sarah was left standing in the freezing cold. staring at the darkened windows of the grocery store. She should leave. She knew that. There was nothing she could do. But her feet stayed rooted to the pavement, her eyes fixed on the shadows within the store. The scraping sound echoed again, distant but unmistakable. And then, as though from nowhere, a shape appeared in the window. The figure she had seen before, now standing in the middle of the store, only this time it was moving. It was dragging something, a long, heavy object, scraping it along the floor. The figure seemed to glide slowly across the aisles, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were struggling to walk. Sarah's breath hitched. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the window. The figure turned toward the door, and for a moment Sarah swore it looked right at her. Then, just as quickly, it disappeared into the shadows again. She didn't hesitate this time. She turned and ran. Her car was just a few spaces away, and she reached it in seconds, fumbling with the keys. She jumped in, slamming the door behind her, and started the engine with shaking hands. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror as she backed out of the parking lot, half expecting to see someone following her. But the lot was empty, the store dark and silent behind her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She drove home in a daze, the road stretching endlessly before her. But every time she glanced in the rearview mirror, the same scraping sound echoed in her mind, and she couldn't escape the feeling that the figure from the store was still there, somewhere, following her. By the time she arrived home, it was after midnight, and the street was quiet. She quickly locked the door behind her, still trembling. The scraping sound lingered in her ears, haunting her, even as she tried to shake it off. But it wasn't just in her head, she had heard it, and she knew deep down that she would hear it again. Story the end.
Story number 6.
Jenna had always been a creature of habit. Every Thursday night, without fail, she'd visit the small local grocery store after work. It wasn't the largest store in town, but it was the one closest to her apartment, and it was always quiet during her late-night trips. Perfect for getting in and out quickly without the crowds. Tonight was no different. The store was mostly empty when she walked in, save for a few workers pushing carts of stock and a couple of elderly women slowly making their way through the aisles. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was constant, the kind of background noise that was so familiar it didn't even register anymore. Jenna grabbed a basket and began her usual loop through the store. First, she picked up a loaf of bread, then some eggs. Her feet carried her through the aisles on autopilot, her mind drifting as she absent-mindedly scanned the shelves. She passed the canned goods, the cereal aisle, then the produce section. When she reached the dairy section, she paused to grab a gallon of milk. That's when she heard it. A soft scraping noise. Jenna stopped, milk in hand, and turned toward the sound. It came from the far end of the aisle, near the freezer section. Her heart skipped a beat. The store was mostly empty, and the sound was out of place, unnatural. It wasn't the usual noise of carts or workers restocking. It sounded like something being dragged across the floor. She stood there for a moment, listening. The noise stopped. The silence returned, thick and unsettling. She took a slow breath, trying to push the unease from her mind. It was probably just someone dragging a cart, she thought. Maybe a worker. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jenna didn't usually get spooked by small things, but the scraping noise had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She glanced around. The aisle was still empty. She turned back to the milk, trying to push the feeling away. As she reached for the butter, the scraping started again. Closer this time. Jenna froze, her hand hovering above the butter dish. Her heart rate picked up. This time, the scraping wasn't coming from a distant aisle. It was right behind her. Slowly, she turned around. There was no one there. Her breath hitched as she stared down the empty aisle. No workers, no customers. Just the pale, sterile glow of the lights above. She strained her ears, listening for the sound, but it was gone. She shook her head, trying to clear the growing tension in her chest. She was just being paranoid. It was nothing. The store was old, and sometimes the floors creaked in strange ways. Maybe a cart was left in an odd spot. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. She just needed to get her shopping done. She took a deep breath, grabbed the butter, and quickly moved toward the checkout. The store felt quieter than usual now. The sound of her footsteps on the linoleum floor was the only noise, save for the faint hum of the freezers in the back. The aisles stretched out like empty hallways, and the flickering lights overhead seemed to cast longer shadows. Jenna picked up her pace, moving faster toward the front. When she reached the dairy section, something caught her eye. At the far end of the aisle, a figure stood just at the edge of her peripheral vision. Jenna blinked and turned to look, but the figure was gone. Her stomach dropped. She stood frozen, unsure of what she'd just seen. A man? Or maybe a worker? She couldn't be sure. It had happened too quickly, and the way the person moved, it didn't feel right. It was as though they had vanished into thin air. Her hands started to shake as she picked up her pace again, glancing over her shoulder with every few steps. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. She wasn't sure why, but the store suddenly felt enormous, like she was trapped in an empty maze with no way out. She finally made it to the checkout. The cashier was a woman in her 30s, who barely acknowledged Jenna as she started scanning her items. Jenna tried to steady her breathing, forcing herself to relax. When the woman scanned the last item, Jenna fumbled for her wallet. She noticed something odd then, a small piece of paper wedged between the till and the scanner. It was a note, scrawled in messy handwriting. "Don't turn around." Jenna froze. Her blood ran cold. Her fingers trembled as she carefully slipped the note out from the counter. The ink was smudged in places, but the words were still legible. Her mind raced. Who had left this here? And why? She glanced up at the cashier, whose eyes were focused intently on the register, her expression neutral. She didn't seem to notice Jenna's reaction at all. Swallowing hard, Jenna forced a smile. "Is this your note?" she asked, trying to sound casual. The cashier didn't look up. "I don't know what you mean," she replied flatly. "That's just probably nothing. You can go ahead and pay." Jenna stared at her for a moment longer, but the cashier was already moving on to the next customer, completely indifferent. Jenna hesitated, but then paid for her groceries. The entire time still holding the note in her hand, the words burned into her mind. She left the counter quickly, her breath shallow. Something wasn't right. She could feel the eyes on her again, that same sensation of being watched. But there was no one around. The store was still eerily empty. As she approached the exit, the scraping sound started once more. This time it was behind her. Her heart hammered in her chest. Jenna didn't turn around. She didn't dare. She pushed through the automatic doors and stepped into the cold night air, almost tripping as she hurried toward her car. She fumbled with her keys, desperate to get in, but the scraping noise, louder now, was following her. Every step she took, it followed. Finally, she managed to get into the car, slamming the door behind her. She started the engine, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. But as she drove away, a single figure appeared in the reflection. A man. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his outline was clear. He stood in the doorway of the grocery store, just watching her. She couldn't breathe. She slammed the gas pedal to the floor, speeding away from the store, the scraping noise still echoing in her mind. Jenna didn't sleep that night. The note, the figure, the scraping. It all replayed in her mind over and over until she was convinced that someone was still following her. The next morning, she called the store. Her voice was tight with fear as she asked to speak to the manager. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the woman on the other end said. "Our manager is unavailable. Can I help you with something?" Jenna hesitated. "I was in last night, and something strange happened. A note was left at the register, and there was a person, someone watching me." The woman cut her off. "Ma'am, we don't have any record of a note being left. Maybe you just imagined it. Our store is fine. No incidents." Jenna's blood ran cold as she felt the weight of her words hang in the air. "But the scraping noise?" she said, voice trembling. "The person, wasn't there anyone else working?" "Ma'am," the woman said, her tone shifting. "Are you sure you were at the right store last night?" The line went dead. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was around 10:30 p.m. when Claire stepped into the local grocery store, her mind occupied with the mundane task of picking up a few last-minute items for dinner. She hadn't expected the place to be busy, but the eerie quiet of the store felt more unsettling than usual. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting the aisles in a harsh, unnatural glow. The store wasn't large, just a small local chain with a few rows of canned goods, produce, and a modest dairy section. Claire liked it here because it was close to her apartment and it had a certain charm about it, especially this late at night. It was almost as if she had the whole place to herself. She pushed her cart through the aisles, glancing at the rows of canned soups and boxes of pasta, her thoughts still on the workday that had dragged on longer than usual. It was hard to shake the feeling that something was off, though. The stillness seemed to stretch beyond just the lack of customers. It was the way the air felt. Thick, almost heavy, as though something was waiting to happen. She paused at the bread section and picked up a loaf, trying to shake the creeping unease that settled at the back of her mind. Maybe it was just the late hour, or maybe it was the headache she'd been fighting all day. The cartwheels squeaked as she moved forward, passing through the aisles lined with jars of pickles and bags of chips. There were no employees in sight, and the checkout lanes were empty. It wasn't unusual for the store to be quiet at this time, but it was eerily still tonight. Even the hum of the refrigerators in the back seemed muffled, like they were struggling to operate. Claire shrugged it off and reached for the milk. As her hand touched the cold carton, a sudden scraping noise caught her attention. It wasn't loud at first, just a soft, uneven scraping sound from behind her. Claire turned quickly, expecting to see an employee restocking the shelves, but the aisle was empty. She stood there for a moment, holding the milk, trying to calm her racing heart. It was nothing, probably just the sound of the lights or the air conditioning kicking on. She was overthinking it. But then the scraping came again. This time it was louder, more pronounced. It came from somewhere further down the aisle, near the freezer section. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The noise sounded like something dragging across the floor, the sharp edge of something metallic scraping against the tile. She took a hesitant step forward, peering down the aisle. Nothing. Her stomach churned. She couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. "Hello?" she called out, her voice louder than she intended, echoing off the walls. No answer. The aisle remained empty. Claire's gaze swept across the shelves, searching for any sign of movement, but there was none. She forced herself to take another step, though her pulse quickened. Maybe it was just an old cart stuck somewhere, or a bag of chips caught on the edge of a shelf. She was probably overreacting. But as she moved forward, she heard it again, the scraping sound. This time it was much closer. She stopped in her tracks, her body tensing as the noise scraped against her nerves. It wasn't natural, not like anything she'd heard before in the store. It felt deliberate. She turned around, her eyes scanning the aisle behind her. No one. Claire's breath came faster now, a knot of dread tightening in her chest. She didn't know what she was expecting. Maybe a figure lurking at the end of the aisle, maybe a worker she hadn't seen before, but all she saw was the quiet expanse of empty shelves. The scraping sound continued, and now it was unmistakably coming from directly behind her. Her heart thudded in her chest as she whipped around. There, at the far end of the aisle, was a figure. A person, standing completely still in the shadows near the freezer section. Claire's throat tightened. She couldn't see their face, but she could tell it was a man. He stood motionless, his back to her, one hand hanging loosely at his side. A shopping cart sat beside him, abandoned and half-turned. The scraping sound came again, louder this time. Claire opened her mouth to call out, but the words stuck in her throat. It felt like she had frozen, like something was wrong in the air, something that told her not to approach. The man didn't move. "Excuse me?" Claire said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to sound calm. No response. She took a step toward him, then another, her eyes fixed on the figure. He still didn't move. The longer she stared, the more her gut twisted with unease. Something was wrong. Maybe he was just a regular customer. But then again, it was so late. Why was he just standing there? "Are you okay?" Claire asked, her voice wavering. The man didn't respond. The scraping sound came again, as though it was coming from somewhere else, beneath the shelves, across the floor. It echoed and bounced off the walls. Claire's stomach clenched. She stopped dead in her tracks, and for a moment, she felt like she was in a daze, unable to look away from the figure. But then she heard something else, a faint, eerie noise that made her freeze. A quiet whisper. "Get out!" The voice was so low, Claire could barely hear it over the scrape, but it was there. "Get out!" Her heart skipped a beat. The man, who hadn't moved or acknowledged her presence, suddenly turned his head. His eyes locked onto hers, wide and blank, and then he smiled, a slow, wide grin, too wide, as though it were stretching across his face unnaturally. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Without thinking, she turned and bolted. She didn't look back, her feet pounding against the floor as she raced through the aisles, dodging shelves and crates, not caring that she left her cart behind. The sound of scraping, that horrible noise, followed her, growing louder with each step. She reached the checkout area, her hands trembling as she grabbed her purse and her phone. She barely noticed the cashier behind the counter, a young woman who had been staring blankly at her screen. "Is everything okay?" the cashier asked, her voice flat, as if she hadn't even registered Claire's frantic state. The scraping noise was deafening now, as if the entire store was shaking. Claire couldn't get out fast enough. She pushed through the automatic doors and into the cold night air, gasping for breath, her legs shaky beneath her. She didn't stop until she was safely in her car, slamming the door behind her. She fumbled with the keys, her hands slick with sweat. When she finally started the engine, her eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror. The store was dark now, its empty windows staring back at her. There was no sign of the man, no sign of anyone at all. But something felt wrong. As she pulled away, Claire's heart still raced, the echoes of the scraping sound haunting her. When she finally got home, she locked the doors behind her and sat on the couch, trying to calm down. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she looked down at the screen. A message. It was from an unknown number. "Don't go back." Claire's blood ran cold. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The grocery store was nearly empty when Jake walked in. It was late, past 11 p.m., but he needed to grab a few things before heading home. The air inside was cold, the artificial chill of the refrigerators humming in the background. The overhead lights flickered slightly, casting long, sharp shadows against the shelves. He grabbed a cart and started down the aisles. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual background noise of the store, muffled conversations, beeping registers, carts rolling over the tiled floor, was missing. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the lights. Jake shrugged it off. It was late, after all. The night shift workers were probably in the back, restocking. He continued walking, picking up a carton of eggs, some bread, a 6-pack of beer. As he turned into the produce section, he spotted an old woman standing by the apples. Her back was to him, and she wasn't moving. She just stood there, her head slightly tilted, staring at the fruit. "Excuse me," Jake said, maneuvering his cart around her. She didn't react. He hesitated. Her clothes looked old and worn, a long coat draped over her thin frame. Wisps of white hair stuck out from under a scarf. Something about her posture unsettled him. Too stiff, too unnatural. Trying to shake the weird feeling, he grabbed a few bananas and turned to leave. That's when he heard it. A scraping sound. It was faint but distinct, like something dragging against the floor. He glanced down the aisle, but there was no one else around. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like metal against tile. His stomach clenched. Maybe one of the workers was moving a cart somewhere, or maybe it was just the store settling. He forced himself to move on, heading toward the dairy section. He grabbed a gallon of milk and turned the corner. The scraping noise came again. This time it was much closer. Jake's pulse quickened. He looked around, but the aisles were still empty. He shook his head. He was just tired. That was all. He had worked a long shift at the warehouse, and his brain was messing with him. He pushed his cart toward the checkout. The store felt wrong. The air was thick, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. As he neared the registers, he noticed something strange. The old woman was there. She stood by the self-checkout, facing away from him, just as still as before. A shiver crawled up his spine. How had she gotten there so fast? He had just seen her in produce. There was no way she could have moved that quickly, not without passing him. His grip tightened on the cart. Just pay and go, he told himself. He scanned his items quickly, glancing up every few seconds. The woman hadn't moved. She just stood there, her head slightly tilted, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. The receipt printed, and he grabbed his bags. He took one last look at the woman. Then she turned. His breath caught in his throat. Her face. God, her face. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent, stretched thin over sharp bones. Her eyes were wide and milky, her mouth slightly open as if she was about to speak, but no words came out. The scraping sound started again. Jake's heart pounded. The noise was coming from behind the register, from the darkness beyond the employee door. He didn't wait to see what it was. He turned and hurried toward the exit, his shoes squeaking against the tile. The doors slid open with a hiss, and he stepped into the parking lot. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but he didn't stop moving. He reached his car, fumbling with his keys. As he unlocked the door, he glanced back. The old woman was standing just inside the store, watching him. The scraping sound was still going. Jake didn't look back again. He got in his car, started the engine, and drove away. That night, he barely slept. The sound followed him, echoing in his mind, long after he was safe in his apartment. A week later, he heard about the store on the news. It had shut down overnight. No explanation, no warning, just gone. Jake never went back. But sometimes, late at night, he still heard that sound. Scraping, dragging, getting closer. Story the end.
Story number 9.
Ethan hated working the late shift at Grant's grocery. The pay was decent, and the job was easy enough, but something about the store at night made his skin crawl. The way the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the empty aisles stretching into darkness, the hum of the refrigerators, it all felt unnatural after hours. At 11:45 p.m., Ethan stood behind the register, checking the clock for what felt like the 100th time. Only 15 minutes left. The store was empty, as usual, except for Frank, the janitor, mopping near the dairy section. The place closed at midnight, and hardly anyone ever came in this late. Ethan sighed and turned his attention back to his phone. Just as he started scrolling, the automatic doors slid open with a hiss. A man walked in. Ethan straightened up. Late-night customers weren't unheard of, but they were rare. The man was tall and thin, wearing a long gray coat. His face was shadowed beneath the hood, but Ethan could tell something was off. The man didn't grab a cart. He didn't head toward the aisles like a normal customer. Instead, he stopped just inside the entrance, standing perfectly still. Ethan cleared his throat. "Hey, can I help you find something?" No response. The man just stood there. Ethan glanced at Frank, who was still mopping, oblivious. A chill crawled down his spine. "Sir?" Ethan tried again. The man took a slow step forward, then another. His movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He turned his head slightly, as if listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. The air in the store felt wrong, heavy, thick. Ethan swallowed hard. Store closes in 15 minutes. Still, no response. The man turned down an aisle, disappearing from view. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe the guy was just high or something. As long as he didn't cause trouble, Ethan didn't care. Minutes passed. Then, from the far end of the store, a noise, a scraping sound, long and slow like metal dragging against tile. Ethan's stomach twisted. He glanced at Frank, who had stopped mopping. The old janitor looked up, brow furrowed. "You hear that?" Ethan asked. Frank nodded slowly. "Yeah." They both listened. Scrape. Silence. Scrape. It was coming from the back of the store near the stockroom. Ethan hesitated. He should ignore it. Just 15 more minutes and he could clock out. But something about the sound gnawed at him, made his skin prickle. "I'm gonna check it out," he muttered, grabbing the store's flashlight from beneath the counter. Frank frowned. "Be careful, kid." Ethan nodded and stepped into the aisles. The store was eerily quiet, the shelves casting long shadows under the flickering lights. Scrape. The noise was louder now. Ethan followed it, his grip tightening around the flashlight. He turned into the frozen foods aisle, his breath visible in the sudden cold. The man was there, standing at the end of the aisle. His back was turned, his body rigid. His coat looked damp, darkened in patches like it had been dragged through something wet. Ethan's mouth went dry. "Sir?" No movement. Ethan took a slow step forward. The air smelled strange, metallic, like rust. "Sir, the store is closing." The man twitched, not turned, not shifted, twitched, like something inside him had snapped. Ethan took a step back. The man's head jerked at an unnatural angle. His face was partially visible now, and Ethan's stomach lurched. His mouth was wrong. Too wide, too stretched. The skin around his lips was torn, pulled back as if he had been grinning for too long. His teeth were exposed, yellowed and jagged, his eyes wide and unblinking. Ethan's breath hitched. Then the man moved. Fast. Too fast. Ethan barely had time to react before the man lunged forward with an unnatural, jerky motion. Ethan stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting frantic beams of light. The man didn't make a sound, no footsteps, no breathing, just the scraping. That horrible, metallic scraping. Ethan turned and ran. He sprinted down the aisle, nearly slipping on the freshly mopped floor. "Frank!" he shouted, his voice cracking. Frank was already moving. "Get to the front!" Ethan didn't look back. He ran past the registers, slamming his hands against the automatic doors. They didn't open. His stomach dropped. "Come on, come on!" He pounded on the glass. Behind him, the scraping grew louder. Frank grabbed the emergency exit bar and shoved. The door wouldn't budge. Ethan turned. The man was there, just a few feet away, grinning. Blood dripped from the corners of his too-wide mouth, pooling onto the tile. Then the lights went out. The store plunged into darkness. The only sound was the scrape of metal on tile. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He reached into his pocket, fumbling for his phone. The screen flickered on, casting a dim glow. Behind him, Frank gasped. Ethan turned the phone's light toward the man. He was gone. The store was silent. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dull red glow. Frank was breathing heavily, his hands shaking. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Ethan shook his head. "I don't..." The scraping sound came again, but this time it was all around them, from the aisles, from the ceiling, from the floor beneath their feet. Ethan grabbed Frank's arm. "We need to get out. Now." They ran toward the back exit, bursting into the stockroom. It was freezing in here, colder than it should be. The overhead lights flickered. The scraping was still there. Closer. Frank grabbed the handle of the back door and yanked. Locked. "No. No." Ethan's voice was raw with panic. Then from the shadows, a whisper. Not a voice, not words, just a sound, like something wet and broken attempting speech. Ethan turned. The man was there, only now there were more. At least 5 figures stood in the stockroom's shadows, their faces stretched into grotesque smiles, their bodies twitching with unnatural movements. The scraping sound rose to a deafening pitch. Frank screamed. Ethan grabbed a nearby metal cart and shoved it toward the figures. The lights flickered again. For a brief second, total darkness. Then, silence. When the lights buzzed back on, the figures were gone. The door behind them creaked open. Cold night air rushed in. Ethan and Frank didn't hesitate. They ran. They didn't stop until they reached Frank's truck. They jumped in, slammed the doors, and peeled out of the parking lot. Neither of them spoke. Not as they sped down the road. Not as the grocery store shrank in the distance. Not as the sound of scraping metal echoed faintly behind them. Neither of them ever went back. Grant's grocery closed the next day. No explanation, just shuttered overnight. Ethan never found out why, but some nights when he was alone in his apartment, he swore he could still hear it. Scraping. Waiting. Story. The end.
Story number 10.
The automatic doors slid open with a hollow whoosh, ushering in the frigid night air along with the store's final customer. Shelves stood tall under harsh fluorescent light, their metal frames casting warped shadows on the dull tile floor. James had worked at the Crawford Market for 3 years, and he had seen his fair share of odd late-night shoppers. There was the elderly woman who talked to the canned goods, the man who smelled like pennies and only bought bleach, and the kid who used to rearrange items in alphabetical order. But this guy? Something was off about him. James watched from his spot behind the checkout counter. The man was tall, gaunt, and pale, like a stretched-out corpse. His coat was soaked from the rain, leaving a dark trail of water along the tile as he shuffled through the aisles. His eyes never seemed to land on anything for long. He would pause, touch an item lightly, then move on. Not once did he take anything off the shelves. James exhaled, glancing at the clock, 11:47 p.m. The store closed at midnight, and he just wanted to finish his shift without any more weirdos. "Hey, man," James called out, forcing a polite smile. "Let me know if you need any help." The man stopped. Slowly, he turned his head toward James. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to dull, leaving his face shadowed. His lips moved, but no words came out. James felt a chill creep up his spine. The man resumed his slow, dragging movements, weaving in and out of the aisles. James shook off the unease and started closing duties, counting the register, checking security cameras. The monitors flickered. Static washed over the screen for a moment before clearing. On one feed, the man stood motionless in the frozen foods aisle, staring at the glass door of the ice cream freezer. James squinted. There was something wrong with the reflection. The glass showed the man's image, but it was distorted, stretched unnaturally like it was pressing forward, trying to break free. James rubbed his eyes and looked again. The reflection was normal now. He let out a nervous laugh. "Get a grip, man." The store's intercom crackled. A low, breathy whisper seeped through the speakers. James barely made out words. "Help me." His stomach clenched. He looked up at the security feed. The man was gone. A scraping sound came from aisle 6. James stepped out from behind the counter. His sneakers squeaked against the floor as he cautiously approached the aisle. The store was silent except for the hum of refrigeration units and the distant buzz of the lights. A single can rolled out from the aisle and stopped at his feet. James swallowed hard. He peeked around the corner. The aisle was empty. The shelves were perfectly stocked, nothing out of place. Then, a whisper. "Turn around." James spun, heart pounding, but no one was there. The automatic doors whooshed open. A gust of cold air rushed in, making the overhead banners sway. Outside, the parking lot was deserted, just rows of empty cars beneath the flickering streetlights. James turned back, ready to grab his phone and call it a night, when he noticed something strange. The security monitors, the frozen foods aisle, the reflection. The glass doors still showed a figure standing there, but there was no one in the aisle. James's breath hitched. The reflection tilted its head, staring right at him. Then it raised a hand and knocked on the glass from inside. James staggered back, his pulse hammering. The reflection opened its mouth, stretching wider and wider until it was just a gaping black hole. The store lights flickered. The intercom crackled again. This time it screamed. James clamped his hands over his ears as the sound reverberated through the aisles. The fluorescent bulbs burst overhead, plunging the store into near darkness. He stumbled toward the exit, but the automatic doors stayed shut. Then came the footsteps, not the slow, dragging steps from before. These were quick, erratic, coming from all around him. James backed up against the register, frantically searching for the source. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps stopped. A low voice, almost a whisper, spoke right beside his ear. "You shouldn't have looked." James spun, swinging blindly. His fist connected with nothing but air. The store went deathly silent. Then a sound, a faint tapping. He turned toward the security monitors. The reflection was still there, and it was grinning. A slow, stretching smile that split its face unnaturally wide. The tapping grew louder. The glass door on the monitor cracked. James's body locked up as he watched the screen. A single spiderweb fracture spread outward, distorting the grinning face. Then the glass shattered. The security monitor cut to static. James whirled around. The aisle was empty. But he wasn't alone. The air was wrong. Too thick. Too heavy. It pressed down on his lungs like something unseen was watching, waiting. The intercom crackled one final time, and then darkness. The store's power shut off completely. The automatic doors slid open on their own. A gust of freezing wind rushed in, carrying a whisper. "See you soon." When the power returned 5 minutes later, James was gone. The only thing left was a single, wet footprint leading into the frozen foods aisle. No one ever found him. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The grocery store was nearly empty when Melissa walked in. It was almost midnight, and she was exhausted from a long shift at the diner. She just needed a few things: milk, cereal, maybe some coffee to get her through another early morning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the empty aisles. A lone cashier, a tired-looking young guy, sat behind the counter, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up as she grabbed a basket and made her way toward the dairy section. Something about grocery stores at night always unsettled her. Maybe it was the eerie quiet, the way sound seemed to disappear between the aisles, the occasional hum of the refrigerators or the distant beep of a scanner at the register were the only things breaking the silence. As she turned down the bread aisle, she caught a glimpse of something. Movement at the end of the row. A figure. She froze. A man stood at the far end of the aisle, partially obscured by the shelves. His posture was odd, slightly hunched, his head tilted as if he were listening for something. Melissa's heart gave a nervous little jump. "Excuse me," she said, forcing a polite smile. No response. The man didn't move. She gripped her basket tighter and stepped forward cautiously. As she got closer, she realized something was off about him. His clothes were tattered, his hands pale and motionless at his sides. She could hear his breathing, shallow, ragged. Her instincts told her to turn around. Instead, she took another step. "Sir, are you okay?" The man's head snapped up. Melissa gasped and stumbled back. His eyes were wide and glassy, unfocused. His lips trembled, and for a second she thought he was going to speak. Then, without warning, he turned and walked away. Not toward the register, not toward the exit. He just stepped backward into the next aisle, disappearing from view. A chill crept up her spine. She glanced around. The store was still empty, except for the cashier at the front, still lost in his phone. The place was too quiet. Melissa shook her head. She was just tired, overworked and sleep-deprived. That had to be it. She hurried through the rest of her shopping, tossing items into her basket without much thought. She just wanted to get out of there. As she turned the corner into the frozen food section, a blast of cold air hit her. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It came from somewhere further down the aisle, the sound of fingers drumming lightly against glass. Melissa hesitated. The freezers stretched ahead of her, their glass doors fogged slightly from the cold. The overhead lights flickered, humming louder than before. Tap, tap, tap. She turned her head slowly. There, near the end of the aisle, was the man. He was standing perfectly still in front of one of the freezer doors, his fingers pressed lightly against the glass. His back was to her, but something about his stance made her stomach twist. Then he stopped tapping. He turned his head, just slightly. Melissa barely breathed. A long moment of silence stretched between them. Then the freezer door creaked open, slow and deliberate, and the man stepped inside. Melissa's breath caught in her throat. He didn't hesitate, didn't even seem to acknowledge that freezers weren't meant to be entered. He just stepped inside, vanishing into the thick fog beyond the glass. Melissa stared, heart hammering against her ribs. The door swung shut. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a face slammed against the glass. Melissa screamed. It was him. His wide, glassy eyes locked onto hers, mouth open in a silent scream. His fingers scrabbled against the door, leaving streaks of condensation in their wake. His breath fogged the glass, and for the first time, Melissa saw something in his eyes. Panic. Real, genuine terror. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words she couldn't hear. And then, darkness. The entire store went black. Melissa's scream caught in her throat as the world plunged into silence. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The buzz of the lights vanished. For a moment, there was nothing. Then she heard it, a scrape, soft, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind her. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating. She couldn't see, couldn't move. Then the lights flickered back on. Melissa spun around. The aisle was empty. The freezers were closed. The man was gone. The store was deathly silent. Melissa's legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to move. She stumbled toward the front, heart pounding, breath ragged. She reached the register, slamming her basket onto the counter. "Did you see that?" She gasped. The cashier looked up from his phone, blinking. "See what?" "The man." She turned, pointing toward the frozen section. The aisle was empty. No sign of him. The cashier frowned. "Miss, no one else has been in here for over an hour." Melissa shook her head. "No, I saw him. He went into the freezer. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "Can we check the cameras?" The cashier hesitated. "I mean, sure, but..." He trailed off, clearly thinking she was crazy. Melissa didn't care. She needed proof, needed to know she hadn't imagined it. The cashier led her to the back room, where a row of monitors displayed the store's security feeds. He rewound the footage to a few minutes earlier. Melissa leaned in, eyes scanning the grainy black and white footage. There she was, walking through the store, grabbing groceries, moving toward the frozen section, then stopping, staring at nothing. Melissa's stomach dropped. The aisle was empty. She watched as her own face twisted with fear as she screamed and ran. But there was no man, no freezer door opening, nothing. The cashier glanced at her, uneasy. "You okay?" Melissa didn't answer. She couldn't, because as the footage continued, the camera in the frozen aisle flickered, just for a second. And in that second, she saw something. Not the man, something else. A shape, tall and thin, watching from the shadows beyond the freezer doors. Just before the feed cut out, Melissa grabbed her things and left without another word. She never went back, but some nights she still dreamt of the man, trapped behind the glass, mouth open in a silent scream. Story the end.